Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Anita Grove with the Apalachical and National Estuarine Research Reserve. And thanks for joining our Sci Cafe today. We have Dr. Tom Miller, and he's a professor of biological sciences with FSU, and he's conducted vegetative census on St. George Island since 1999 to document both short and long-term effects on barrier islands. So the effects of hurricanes and droughts on those plants and changes in plant abundance. Dr. Miller came to Florida State as an ecologist in 1989, and he's currently with the Department of a professor with the Department of Biological Sciences. His research has been on small aquatic communities found in the leaves and purple pitcher plants of vegetation on St. George Island. So without further ado, Tom, if you want to take it away, it's all yours.
Is that volume good?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay. So yeah, I'm Tom Miller, Florida State, and I'm a community ecologist, meaning that I just explore diversity in any sort of community I want. You know, what controls diversity? What controls like the number of species in your lawn? If you go out and look at your lawn, most lawns we'd like to have just one nice species of grass there, but instead, if it's like my lawn, it has about 30 different species of stuff. Well, why 30? Why not 25? Why not 35? And so that's in an overly simplistic way, that's what I do. A lot of my work has been on these small little communities and pitcher plants, but like right now, there's a bunch of students in my lab that are studying parasite diversity inside of sharks. So I kind of work on a variety of different systems because it's fun. But what I'm going to talk to you today about is something that's been very close to my heart, this long-term work on St. George that I've been out visiting since I got here in '89. It's just such a beautiful place and a wonderful community as an ecologist to study. I'm going to start by kind of chastising people a little bit. Let's see if I can get this to change. There we go. About something called green or plant blindness. And so this is the tendency of people to just not notice plants or not recognize what they do. We think of plants as just something we eat, or maybe something that, you know, your animals eat in some way, but we don't recognize the other roles of plants and what they do on Earth. And so a lot of plant biologists or botanists or plant ecologists often complain about the fact that their plants are understudied in many ways, and we just don't really recognize how important they are. And so that's very relevant to what I'm going to talk about today, because I really want to convince you that plants on dunes are critical to our shorelines. So I'm going to give you some take-home points. This is supposed to be a pretty casual seminar, so I hope there are lots of questions at the end. I wish you were all here with me. And normally I'm used to talking to 165 students in a lecture hall. I get feedback. I'm not sure I really like just talking to my computer, but it works nice to communicate with a lot of people. So I've made some fairly simple points I really hope you get out of this talk. And so I'll just kind of go through these in some way. And the first is that barrier islands are just really important and also very, very interesting because there's this reciprocal interaction between the plants and the dunes themselves. And so to think about that, first of all, we have to know a little bit of geology. You have to recognize the barrier islands are really created by the fact that ocean levels have gone up and down with different glacial periods. And when they do, they leave sand behind them on the shore. And when the water comes back up at the end of the glacial period, then the water levels come back up, like in the Gulf. This happened, started about 8,000 years ago. Then you end up with that water pushing sand in front of it. The water rises faster than the sand, so it leaves these islands that are often 3 to 5 miles off the coast. That means most of the barrier islands that we have are about 4,000 to 6,000 years old. They're just since the last glacial period. What you need for an island is just a lot of sand, which up here it's silicaceous sand coming down rivers, and you need wind, and you need then waves blowing, or sorry, you need waves carrying the sand to the beach, you need wind blowing it up the beach. Recognize that barrier islands make up most of the coastline of the southeastern United States. And so some 80% of the coastline has barrier islands on it. So they are the dominant coastal ecosystem that we have. In Florida, again, they make up about 80% of the coastline of Florida. The only part that doesn't have much is the Big Bend area. So they are an incredibly important ecosystem in Florida. The way the dunes form now, which is different than the island itself, is where the plants start to come in the story. And so this is from a graphic from a little paper we published earlier this year talking about how foredunes operate. But what you have again is you have sand that's being coming off the ocean and onto a beach plateau of some sort. The wind is blowing that sand inland. You start to get plants grow right at the very edge of the water. And so those plants at the very edge of the water are in an incredibly harsh environment. So they're in an environment where there's really salty soils, there's virtually no fresh water, it's hot, it's really just kind of a miserable place to grow. But the plants that can grow there can block the wind. And when they block the wind, it slows that wind down so it drops any sand that it's carrying. And so when that happens, the sand builds up around those plants, and you get these little proto-dunes like in the second diagram there. And you've probably seen these, or if you go to St. George, look at them, or any, or you go to your favorite barrier island or sandy coastline, and right at just above the high tide line, you'll see these little higher areas that have a plant in the middle of it. And that's where you get these little proto-dunes starting. When you get a lot of proto-dunes in a line, they'll form a dune. The dune will stop even more wind blowing, and so more sand will fall out, and you get taller and taller dunes. The plants themselves then extend roots down deeper and deeper into the soil, and so they act to then stabilize the dune in a lot of ways. Note, as you can see in here, that the islands are often usually growing, and so that bottom figure shows that there's less water in the bottom figure. That's because the island is growing out as well as all that sand is coming onto the island. That provides more room then in front of the original dune, and you start to then get a second line of dunes growing. So you'll get a series of dunes and troughs then develop. But the plants are creating the dunes, and the dunes are creating different habitats for the plants. Because that dune in the back now doesn't get much salt spray, it doesn't get any salt water. And so you can completely different plants then can grow on the dunes in the backs, and different plants can grow in the troughs between the dunes. This also creates really different shapes to different islands. And so the different shapes of islands are determined by the fact that you get different amounts of wind, different amounts of sand, different rates of plant growth, and different disturbance rates from things like hurricanes can give you very different sorts of shorelines. So it's a pretty interesting area for biophysicists to work in. But that's just the foredune. In reality, most barrier islands around the world, and about 10% of the world's coastlines are barrier islands. There are more around here, but overall, 10% of the ice-free coastlines in the world are barrier islands. But what happens is that the foredune gets blown out occasionally by things like hurricanes. It floods the area behind it. The area behind it also deeply floods with fresh water when you get big storms come through. And it flattens the area behind it. And so this is called an overwash plateau, or what we call an inner dune. And so you end up with kind of these three separate habitats. You have the foredunes, you have the inner dune that's flooding in my little video here, and then you have a series of older dunes in the back, lower dunes and troughs. These are eroded dunes with little wetland areas between them. So that gives us these three habitats: foredunes, inner dunes, and back dunes, with some representative photos there. The inner dunes sometimes can flood, sometimes can be very dry. And the most disturbed ones are the foredunes, the more stable ones are the back dunes. And so I'm going to talk about those 3 habitats specifically most of today. So barrier islands, I hope you realize if you live in Florida that they're incredibly important for protecting inland areas from storms. They're also incredibly important for tourism, which our tax dollars are based on tourism in Florida. They're important because they protect nursery areas such as oyster beds and seagrass beds, which are important for fisheries and aquaculture. They provide habitat for a number of plants and animals. We have something like 6 endangered species on St. George Island. Several different sea turtles and a couple of different birds, and so they provide habitat for endangered species as well as a number of other important species on these islands. So barrier islands are really common and really important throughout the Gulf and southeastern United States. Okay, so what have we been doing out there? Well, we started off being really curious about what hurricanes did to these communities. I had a postdoc and I who both came from desert systems, and we recognized that barrier islands weren't the lush tropical islands with palm trees that we might have envisioned when we moved to Florida, but instead can be really harsh environments of extremes. They can be flooded part of the year, they can be incredibly dry part of the year, they can have cactus on them. They are a harsh environment in most ways. And so, and also the plants out there we notice kind of change all the time, different seasons and different years. And so we wanted somebody to try to capture that and to try to quantify in particular how important hurricanes were for maintaining those patterns. So at the time we were doing another project out on the tip of St. George Island. I hope you can see here that there's Apalachicola where Anna is, the bridge out to St. George. Here's little St. George off to the left. And we are way out there on the right where that white circle is. And so we started work in 1988, really, or 98, way out the tip of St. George Island. And what we have out at the tip, this is just a photograph of the tip from a satellite photograph, is we have 9 big quadrats out there, grids we call them. And the yellow grids are on the foredunes, what were the foredunes, the green ones are inner dunes, and the brown ones there, I guess, are back dunes. Each one of those is 60 meters by 60 meters. And even inside of each one of those, we have a 7 by 7 grid of stakes, each stake 10 meters apart from the other. So we have 9 plots, and in each of those plots, we have 49 sampling points. And so that gives us a total of 441 plots out there that we quantify vegetation on. Oops, my slide's moving. Note that when we started this study, and I'll show you a slide in a minute, but this F2 plot right there was actually on the shoreline, and the island has just simply grown out that much. It causes a little bit of difficulty in maintaining replicate foredune plots, but I'm not going to go into that today. So on each of those points, those 49 points in each of the 9 grids, we throw down a meter square plot every year and count all the vegetation, and we've been doing it for the last 25 years. Vegetation is quantified by percent cover. We also take elevations, and so those figures at the top show kind of representative grids where we can look at the elevation. So the foredune has a big foredune across it. That's probably our foredune 2 plot. Inner dunes are much lower, and the green doesn't mean they're wet, it just means it's low elevation. The brown means it's high elevation. Whereas back dunes are a mixture of kind of low areas and higher dune areas, though they're not as high as the foredunes. We've also sporadically taken soil traits like soil moisture, percent organic matter, some soil nutrients of different types as well. So just real quickly, here's kind of what that actually looks like on the tip. There's Dog Island way back there in the back, and we're going through those proto dunes right there. We're starting to get into some more established foredunes with all the vegetation on them. We're going over the last big standing foredune right there, and then we're going to get into some inner dune. And this part of the island has an extensive inner dune, and you'll see water flooding. So this is after one of our big storms, and that area flooded badly. And this is a particularly extensive inner dune area, but eventually it'll lead us up to less degraded, more established dunes in the back dune area, where you'll see me standing flying the drone. So there's another little proto dune there. And here's the back dune. You can see a couple of stakes there in the ground if you happen to see them. Those are the stakes for our plots. So we measure this exact same area year after year after year. And so there you can see the foredunes in the back, the broad inner dune, and then the rolling back dunes. Now again, one of the things we're really interested in are hurricanes, and so I do want to point out that, of course, hurricanes are really important to these islands. This is the island after Hurricane Michael in 2018. And after big hurricanes, because of storm surge, the tip of the island breaks up into about 6 little small islands for a few hours, and the water washes over from one side to the other. And so this used to be a continuous foredune all down this section of the island, and it just wiped it all out. It just takes it all out. I think one of my favorite photographs is this one. And so that little square house in the middle of that photograph, the little rectangular house, that's where you pay money to go into St. George. That's the, right there at the entranceway to St. George State Park. And you can see it's just like, a giant came and took his hands and shoved the foredunes back across the island. It's just kind of amazing what the hurricanes can do in a short period of time. Do recognize, though, that there's also just this gradual movement, which comes with the dune building. And so the gradual movement of sand by wind and water builds islands. And so in 1999, when we started, that's what the tip of the island looked like, and we set up one of our plots right there on the shoreline. By 2007, it was a quarter of a kilometer inland. By 2016, it's almost a half kilometer inland. 2024, so you can see the island has gradually grown out and grown about a half a kilometer overall from 1999 to 2024. So it's pretty incredible how much change goes on out there. It's not from hurricanes, but just occurs gradually. Okay, so what have we been doing with this? And in particular, what does it tell us about hurricanes? Maybe are they important? And how do they affect this interaction between the dunes and the plants? So I'm gonna, it's really hard to summarize a huge amount of data, and some of it is too complicated. And so I'm gonna show you these patterns, and you don't really need a lot of the complicated stuff to understand most of these patterns. This is just the number of species in a square meter plot. Again, we have 441 of those square meter plots out there. And so we can just count the number of species per plot and then average it and look at it through time. And so if you look at just the black line there, and ignore everything else for the moment, that shows you for foredunes. Black one will always be the foredunes. It shows you the number of species in different years that we find on our foredune plots. Similarly, the red is for interdunes. The blue is for back dunes. So if this was a big undergraduate class, I'd stop right now and I'd say, okay, so we need to work on our graph interpretation here. How do you read graphs? And I'd say, I want you to find me 3 patterns from this data. And so I'm actually going to do that. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds here to look at this graph and think, what can you learn from this graph? Go. Okay, so that's about 30 seconds, which might be not be enough time, but hopefully it's allowed you to grasp what this graph is showing anyway. So I hope that what you got out of this is clearly there are fewer species in the foredunes. So foredunes are highly disturbed, they're very harsh, there aren't as many plants on them. You get a much higher diversity, maybe twice as many species per plot in the back dunes. By the way, I don't know why ecologists use the word richness. It really is just the number of species on a square meter plot in our case. So you get the most species in back dunes, you get the fewest species on foredunes. That's the first pattern. Second pattern is that the number of species over the 25 years of our study have doubled per meter squared. And so, the average plot in 1999 in the foredune had about 2 species. By 2024, it had 4 species. The average plot in the back dunes had 4 species in 99 and up to 8 species by 2024, actually about 2022 or so. And so the number of species per plot on the island has doubled across all 3 of our habitats. And that's really amazing. And I'll talk about this more, but we don't really know why. And then finally, you can see the third pattern here is you can see the big effects of hurricanes. And so George occurred just before we started the census. Ivan and Dennis occurred in 2004 and 5. And you can see there's a big drop in diversity. Hermine caused a little drop, and then Michael caused a big drop. And then oddly enough, 2024 here, when Helene came through last year, I don't think a lot of us thought it was a big hurricane. It's not going to go down in the archives as a big hurricane for our area. The island differs. The island thinks, yeah, that was a big hurricane, especially in back dune areas, back dunes and interdunes. Foredunes were less affected. And there was a massive kind of storm surge, it seemed to come from the bay and not the ocean as much with Helene. So it was a very interesting hurricane. And so if so those are our three patterns. There's obvious effects that there's differences in the habitats with more in the back dunes. Hurricanes drop diversity, and time increases diversity. So through time, we're getting more and more species. Also want to point out from this, though, that if you just kind of try to draw a line across the top of these things, it indicates that while hurricanes have huge effects, the island recovers quickly. So look at Michael. So Michael caused this big drop in the number of species that are there. But a year or two later, all those species are back, and we're right back on the same track. And so across any of our big hurricanes, it might take 3 or 4 years. It might take 1 or 2 years, but the island recovers really quickly from hurricanes. And so we tend to think of them as being really dramatic factors that really affect dunes in particular. But the plants recover very quickly. And maybe this makes sense. You know, these are dune plants that have evolved to survive in these sorts of harsh environments with hurricanes. And so I guess we shouldn't be surprised that when big hurricanes come through, they recover quickly. But it's very impressive. All right, so this doubling, baffles us. And I have to say, I'm not going to give you any explanation for it today, but I can show you some of the things we're looking at. So a lot of this is kind of work in progress. And it's trying to take that simple pattern that I've shown you so far and provide a more complex look at it as best we can. So here's our simple pattern. Clearly, though, even though we know, for example, that species number doubles, well, how? Is it new species? Is it old species? What kind of species? Those are the sorts of questions we're trying to answer now. And so we could just look at all the individual species. And so we have about 72 species out there at the tip, maybe up to 80, I think, close to 80. That's not the number of species on St. George Island. I think Lauren Anderson suggested there are about 372 species, native species on St. George Island. But there are a lot of species. And so for each species, I could show you a graph like one of these little graphs showing how the vegetation's changed in the last 25 years in inner dunes, foredunes, and back dunes using the same colors as before. The black is the foredune, the red is the inner dune, and the blue is the back dune. But you know, I could show you all 82 of these for our species out there, 72 of these for our species, but you know, it's hard to draw information from it. It's hard to absorb that and get some information from it. So I'm going to show you a few of these just to show you that the patterns differ a lot. And so here's sea oats. This is a very important species. It's what ecologists might call a foundation species because it allows a lot of other species to occur out there because it stabilizes dunes, has very deep roots, and can be found on the foredunes and on the beach. And you can see it's decreasing a lot through time. If this is a general pattern for Florida, I'd be really worried. And we're actually trying to look at some other sites now and figure out whether it is a general pattern or not. But it's a big concern that the species is declining. Here's Gulf blue stem, Schizocara marinum. And in this case, it's actually increasing in some of the habitats. And so particularly in the foredunes where Uniola is decreasing, this other important grass is increasing. So maybe it's replacing some of the role of Uniola. Other parts of the habitat looks like it's kind of staying fairly constant through time. So we've got some species increasing, some species decreasing, and what they do may depend upon which habitat they're in. Here's one of my favorites, Heterotheca subaxillaris, showing a third sort of pattern. This is what's called camphor weed, and it has the little yellow flowers. If you go out to St. George right now, what you're going to find is a lot of this. It was a big year for camphor weed. And so probably a month or two ago, it was much prettier than it is right now. Now a lot of it's gone to seed. So the tops of the plants are starting to die, and there's just a lot of dead flowers and dispersing seeds. So it's not quite as attractive, but it's very common out there. And if you look across time here, you find this striking pattern that it's extremely affected by hurricanes. And that's because this species is salt intolerant. It cannot take salt water. So when Ivan and Dennis occurred, we had those 2 hurricanes in a row, it virtually eliminated camphor weed from the tip of St. George Island. It slowly recovered over 4 or 5 years. You can see there's a similar effect with Michael that recovered faster. And so this is a species that the pattern through time is driven by storm surge, and that's not uncommon either. So some species increase, some species decrease, some species show a more complex pattern associated with climate, with storms and droughts. And then finally, we have things like this. This is not a happy story for me. This is wax myrtle. And so wax myrtle, we started noticing in about 2015, we found a few seedlings. We didn't even know what it was until they started getting bigger. And yet now it's totally dominating some wetter areas of the island. It's a tall shrub. It's just going to change everything out there to have this dense shrub in what used to be a grassland. And it's really dramatic, and particularly in inner dune areas right now. And so there's another sort of pattern, is we can have sudden appearances and disappearances of species. So it's a very complex pattern. Some species increase, some decrease, and some show other sorts of patterns. I'm not sure how much to go over these, but one way we've tried to look at it is simply look at the species of, here's the 25 most abundant species on foredunes are listed on the left by their scientific first name. And so Uniola paniculata at the top there, that red bar, that represents sea oats. Whoops, that represents sea oats. And the bars change at 0, so either go from blue to red at the 0 line. That indicates whether or not they've increased or decreased over the last 25 years. So the fact that Uniola shows a red bar means it decreased significantly. If it shows a blue line, it's increased significantly. And if it shows a gray bar, that means it hasn't, it's stayed about the same. It hasn't significantly changed. And so what you can see is some species have decreased, like Uniola. Other species have increased, and in fact, more species have increased, which makes sense since we know the number of species per plot has doubled. And so this allows us to now go back and look at specific species and maybe look at their traits and try to figure out what's increasing or decreasing. It also allows us to see patterns like this. This is the same thing, but for inner dunes. But again, the order here is the order of their abundance in 1999. And so the fact that all the bars at the top are red tells us that all the dominant species are declining and they're being totally replaced by new species. And so that's really interesting for the inner dunes. It's going through a wholesale change in the types of species that are there. Finally, in back dunes, you find a similar sort of kind of some increase, some decrease. It's much more like the foredunes. But again, we can use this data to start looking at kind of what species are increasing, which are decreasing, and start to think about what traits are associated with those species. Another way of looking at this, I debated whether or not showing you this graph, and I apologize for the horrible colors, but I didn't want to use, the red and blue that I used in the other figures. So this graph simply keeps track of the number of species, and so I've already shown you that foredunes gradually increase through time. Inner dunes, the number of species increase through time, and the back dunes increase through time. But if we just look at the top graph right here, I'm just dividing the total number of species up into ones that were there in 1999, ones that were on the island in 1999. They were someplace in our plots, but they weren't on a given plot, and that's the orange. We're going to call that regional. And then species that are completely new to our plots are in yellow. So you notice that the first bar in 1999, everything is original because that's how we defined it. Those in 1999, it's 100% original species. And then it shows that the number of original species declined and started to be replaced. But at some point, you get this stable set of original species. It doesn't change much after time. The new species all come from these regional species or from totally new species to the island. So it shows us that even though the number of species per plot is doubling, it's not just adding species. We're losing species at the same time. We're just adding species faster than we lose them. And the same thing's true in all three habitats. I'm not going to go through the inner dune or back dune, but it's the same sort of pattern. What is also interesting here, though, is if you look at hurricane effects. So this is V-shaped thing over here in 2018, that's Hurricane Michael. And when that occurs, you can see that the new species and the regional species are affected a lot. The original species aren't. So those original species are tough guys that are staying out there. They're pretty much unaffected by changes in habitat and climate that's going on out there. It's the new species that are less maybe adapted to those habitats, and so that are more affected by things like hurricanes. So what's causing this? Well, as an ecologist, the first thing I might think about is climate change. And so the top graph there shows you in red the average temperatures per year from 1999 to 2024. And you can see that the temperatures out there, I think there's a mildly significant increase in temperatures, but it's very minor. And in fact, temperatures vary a huge amount from year to year. The blue line gives you precipitation, which is the same thing. Precipitation has not significantly changed over the 25 years of our study. There's wet years, there's dry years, but there's no pattern overall. So even though we know with climate change, it's getting warmer, some places it's getting wetter, some places it's getting drier, a few places it's getting cooler. In the Gulf so far, there aren't as huge effects on temperature. And so we don't think that the patterns we're seeing, this doubling in the number of species there, is being driven by temperature and rainfall. That's debatable, but that's kind of our conclusion at this point. The bottom graph is a little confusing, I apologize, but the orange line is the key on the left showing you average sea level. And so, as some of you may know, the average sea level in the Northern Gulf, around Apalachicola, is that the sea level has increased about 6 to 8 inches. And so we've had very significant sea level increase in the last 25 years. And the up and down on that orange line shows you the seasonal variation, but otherwise there's been kind of a continuous increase in the sea level through time. The blue line is on a different scale, so you can't really compare the scales, but that shows you the high tide in different months. And so this is really showing you effects of storms. So this is storm surge. So whenever you see huge peaks there, well, there's Hurricane George way over in 1998. There's Dennis in 2004 and 5, Dennis and Ivan, and then Michael in 2018. And so not only has sea level risen, but we also have these storm surges that can be very important as well. So here's the one place where you see the climate has changed a lot. And this increase in the water level can raise the freshwater lens on an island. Basically, on a barrier island, the fresh water underground there is sitting on top of salt water. And if the salt water level goes up, then the freshwater level goes up. And so our interdune areas seem to be changing a lot because they're getting a lot wetter. And when we started the study for the first 10 years, there were never any permanent ponds out there. Now there's several areas that have virtually permanent ponds. I mean, I was out there on Tuesday and they're pretty dry right now. They're still muddy, but there isn't a lot of standing water, but they're there. They never used to be there. They used to dry completely during droughts. And so it's definitely a wetter environment in all three of our habitats out there. So we can also try to look at this, and again, looking at those graphs that showed whether species increase or decrease, we can start to ask what types of species are increasing or decreasing. Well, I did want to take this opportunity to say that we have virtually no invasive species out there on the tip of the island. It's all native species. These terms are hard to use sometimes because they may be, we may have a species show up out there like wax myrtle that hasn't been out on the island for a long time, but it's native to Florida, and so we still call it a native species. And so we can also divide grasses into whether or not they're grasses. Sorry, we can divide species up into whether or not they're grasses, forbs, or have woody material in them like shrubs or trees. And we can divide them into whether or not they're annuals or perennials. And we can ask, have these patterns changed through time? And they haven't significantly. We can also do the same thing, but divide plants into whether or not they're C3 or C4. And geez, maybe you can remember back to botany in college if you had it. But basically, the C3 and C4 are different ways in which plants take carbon dioxide into the leaf, and plants that are C4 are better in dry conditions, and plants that are C3 are probably grow better in wet conditions. And so it's actually often something that changes as the habitat changes. And we've seen some minor changes, an increase in the number of C4 plants in these plots, but we haven't seen anything dramatic and changes in these traits of the species. But this is kind of work in progress. I'm not showing you a lot of detail here at all. We're doing the same sort of thing by looking at species in foredunes at the top, interdunes in the middle, and back dunes at the bottom here. But we're classifying species by whether or not they're by their wetland status. Are they obligate wetland species? Are they facultative wetland species? Or are they upland species that are never found in wetlands? And we're asking whether or not those patterns change through time. It's some work I'm doing with a graduate student, Josh Rowe, but nothing else is changing. And we're not seeing any significant changes yet. We're now trying to look at salt tolerance to see if the same patterns hold. But the reason why I'm showing you this complicated graph and not describing it too much is I want you to realize that what we're doing is we're saying, geez, what are the traits of these species that are increasing and decreasing? And maybe does that tell us something about the mechanisms of what's going on and this doubling of species number out on the island? All right, so that's about it. I wanted to do a few other things. First of all, I wanted to put in a promo for long-term studies. We published a paper about the first 8 years of the study that basically said, yeah, we think hurricanes are important, but we couldn't even document this doubling in species number yet. We couldn't ask what species were increasing or decreasing. Understanding complex patterns in ecological communities requires long-term studies, and there aren't very many done in the Gulf. There aren't very many done on coastal shorelines. And so our study is actually very unique. It's certainly very unique for Florida. It's very unique for the US. It's very unique for the world. And so there are very, very few studies like ours. Long-term studies are just hard to do. We've actually even published a paper talking about why long-term studies are hard to do and how you can manage it. And there's some lists of the problems here. You know, agencies don't want to fund them because they're long-term. They don't want to commit to long-term. It's hard to find a location over time that you can continuously use. And I feel incredibly lucky to work at St. George State Park. Not only have the staff there been wonderful, but DEP's been very gracious in permitting us to continue working out there. It's a unique area because the tip of the island is fairly protected. We are really lucky to work out there. It's been great. So there's several other things there that make long-term studies difficult, but I'm not going to talk about them too much. It's everything from, I mentioned park closures due to storms. And so, you know, when you get a hurricane, you may not get to your field site. So things like that you have to worry about. Long-term studies do depend on volunteers because nobody funds them. And so it's hard to have money to pay for people to go out and do the work out there. I also wanted to, at the end here, point out that we do a lot of other studies out there. And so I worked with a student named Tiffany Knight to look at the fact that that some of the species that occur in both dune bottoms and dune tops have actually apparently very different genotypes at bottoms and tops. And so this is like, it's the same species, but it's genetically different, just, you know, a few meters apart from the top of the dunes and the bottom of the dunes. Elise Gornish, a really wonderful graduate student, was predicting, she was going back to our long-term data and saying which species do well after storms, and saying, geez, maybe we should look at using those as restoration species. A lot of restoration right now, for example, just uses Uniola. Our work suggested maybe it should be using Schizocara and some other species, might be better species after restoration because they come back better after storms and then they withstand later future storms better. I did some work looking at those proto-dunes and what species grow on those proto-dunes on dune tops with an undergraduate, Matthew Green. With Danny Davis, more recently, we worked looking at rack. We're very curious about where nutrients come for the plants on the dunes. I mean, they're living in just pure sand. There are very few soil nutrients naturally out there. So where are those plants getting their nutrients? And Danny looked at whether or not rack coming in from the ocean was important for those nutrients. Recently, we've done some work on soil microbial communities. And so we can go out there and sample the soil. And I work with a group at the University of Arizona who then sequences all the bacteria and fungi in the soil. And so we can start asking, do foredunes, interdunes, and back dunes differ in the type of soil bacteria there? We can start asking whether those soil bacteria belong to different groups that might be important for nutrient dynamics. It turns out, for example, that fungi are very abundant in interdunes or foredunes, but not abundant in the other areas. And so that may have implications for the soil dynamics that interact with the plants. So lots of different ways of looking at that. And then finally, in those wetland areas, this is what it'll look like after the water drains away. And it's a little hard to see in this picture, but there's a solid dried algal mat sitting there on top of the grass. And the grass is kind of holding it up in the air. And so there's a huge amount of algae that grow in the wetter areas of the dunes that then dry up and break up and get into the soil. And so Sarah Kate Ginter, one of my former grad students, she just finished this summer. She looked at what species are in the algae, and it turns out a lot of them are blue-green algae. And blue-green algae can fix nitrogen out of the air. And so this may be a really important source for nitrogen in the soil out there. So lots of other studies going on out there besides just the long-term census. That's about it. I do want to thank the huge number of volunteers. And so every year this takes 10 to 15 people to do the census. It's a lot of work censusing all 441 plots and doing the surveying and doing maintenance, a lot of other things out there. Most of them are graduate students and a few faculty from Florida State. It's a lot of fun. but it's also a lot of work every year, and I really am grateful to the students who've gone out there and helped. And then finally, of course, I have to acknowledge people who have helped. It's very hard to get long-term support for projects. And so originally I did this as part of a class, and then I got some funding from the National Hurricane Center. I got a small grant from the university for a while. I had a U.S. Fish and Wildlife grant for a while. I had a couple of years of NSF money after the oil spill. I had money from the Northern Gulf Institute at one time. And I paid for it out of pocket for many years. And right now my funding comes from DEP, has a wonderful beaches program through DEP. And that looks like that'll fund us for a few years into the future. And most of that is arranged through ANR. And so I'm incredibly grateful to ANR for helping us arrange funding and for providing other sorts of support and advice working out on the tip of St. George Island. And so that's all I have to say. I'd be happy to take questions. Now I have to figure out how to get out of this.
You can just leave it up. It's fine. You might want to go back if somebody asks a question about the presentation. Does anybody have any questions? I'll unmute everybody so you can unmute yourself. You'll have the ability or raise your hand if you have a question, either way. Okay. You have Jenna, would you like to ask your question? You should be able to unmute. Huh. Try again. Okay. I don't know why it keeps saying unmute all attendees.
Yeah, that'll keep the questions down. That's great.
We have questions. For some reason, it says it's unmuting, but, and I think it's that you have to unmute yourself, but that's the only message I'm getting. Or you could type it in the question box. I'm giving people a minute to put their somebody's on mute.
Hi, Anita. It's Becky Dolan. Can you hear me?
I can.
Hi, Tom. I live on the sound side, just outside the park, and I have a question. We have a lot of wax myrtle, so I'm kind of surprised by your comments. Is it found in other? Didn't see it at that end of the park, but is it? Could you talk some more about finding that coming in and your thoughts on it?
Oh, I think you're muted, Tom. We can't hear you. Can you unmute your mic? Still can't hear you. I don't know why. We heard you fine earlier. Yep, now you seem very distant.
Yeah, okay, I think what happened, yeah, anyhow, I'm back. So
Okay.
wax is a coastal problem everywhere. And everything I'm talking about in this talk really is just that eastern tip of the island. Any place where there's been a lot of disturbance and there can be wetland areas, you'll get wax myrtle in. We're still surprised throughout the park that it really hasn't occurred much in the park at all until recently. And so I've talked to Mr. Hodson about this some. I know they're a little bit concerned about thinking how to control it, but I haven't talked to them about it recently. I have talked to people statewide about it. And, for example, could you use fire to control it? And apparently it grows back so fast that fire isn't an effective method for controlling it. One thing that controls it is salt water. So if we have more hurricanes, we might get rid of some of it. But otherwise, it's just kind of a well-known problem. I mean, it's a natural process, so I don't want to describe it as like an invasive species that we have to get rid of. But it is kind of annoying, and it's less attractive in the habitat. And it cuts down on diversity of other species. But that's about all I know about it.
Okay. And Jenna, I don't know if you can come off mute, but Jenna asked, she said, Tom, great talk. I'm sorry if I missed it, but are you measuring the elevation in plots?
We measure the elevation of all 441 plots every year. And this allows us to show, for example, that the foredunes can change dramatically sometimes. It allows us to show that some of the other parts of the dunes are incredibly stable. We tend to think of sand dunes like in the Sahara Desert or something. You see movies of the sand blowing around all the time and the dunes shifting and like snakes and from above. That doesn't happen on St. George. The dunes are mostly very stable. And so I can put out a toothpick and come back 10 years later and find the same toothpick there in the back dunes. The foredunes can be dramatically affected by storms and particularly showing erosion between storms. So our surveying allows us to quantify those changes that are caused by storms and gradual erosion.
Great. And then Megan asked, Megan Lamb, who works here also, I'm glad you mentioned invasive species because I was curious about the presence of those. Have you seen red or black mangroves in your transect areas? We at ANR have several bayside areas on St. George. We're monitoring for the spread of mangroves.
Yeah, great question. So I've had a grad student at the Marine Lab, Rachel, who worked on the mangroves throughout this area. And so I'm very familiar with it. We don't have any out near us at all. I've certainly seen them on St. George. I've seen them particularly on the back of Little St. George, but none in our plots, anywhere near our plots. It wouldn't surprise me if they start showing up on one of our back dune plots, which has a more salt marshy sort of area to it, but it might not be for a few years.
Yeah, they're getting ours are getting kind of large. The ones we've been monitoring. It's amazing.
Yeah.
We haven't had a cold spell.
Yeah, the grad student Rachel was able to show that cold spell 2 or 3 years ago really knocked him back in some places. I don't think it got rid of them. And so it's like the hurricanes. I think it would take a number of really severe cold spells to get rid of them. Instead, they're going to keep coming.
Yeah. And then Nick Vitale has he said, excellent presentation, given your work of long-term patterns of plants and quick recovery following major storms. I'm wondering if your prospective dune planting efforts and human intervention are more generally following large disturbance events versus natural recovery.
So the restoration work we did was not, we used data, storm data, to ask which species would be good to recover after a storm. We didn't do the restoration experiment itself after a storm. And so that's an important distinction. What we did is take 6 of the species that we thought would be really good after restoration and 6 that we thought wouldn't be good, and then planted them out in foredunes, interdunes, and back dunes, and asked how much growth did we get in, I think, 1.5 years or something. And we were able to show that the species that we predicted would do well after storms did do well out there in these habitats, but it wasn't necessarily after a storm. They just grow well in those habitats. So it would be interesting to do that sort of work during storm and non-storm periods. It's just a little hard to predict when hurricanes occur to do those sorts of experiments. Be fun to do.
Yeah. And I got a quick question. You mentioned about sea oats, planting sea oats, that you had another species that you were finding was a little bit more durable than the sea oats, and I didn't catch the species name.
Gulf blue stem.
Gulf?
Yeah, Gulf blue stem.
Okay.
Schizocara marinum. And there might even be others. I'd have to go back and look at our publication that certainly would do as well as Uniola. There's a lot of people have also suggested that single species planting isn't necessarily the best way to go either. There's a woman named Debbie Miller, I think, who had even done some experiments through IFAS on that on dunes in West Florida. And so, in general, if I was talking to restoration people, I would encourage them, to not just use Uniola. Uniola is very convenient because it's easy to cultivate, and so there are a number of growers that cultivate it, and the state can just buy seedlings from them and just plant them out. And there's a high survival rate of seedlings, and so it's a great species to use for restoration. I often wonder if it would be better to use a mixture of species, though, not just Uniola, and in particular include things like Gulf blue stem.
Yeah, that certainly is a good approach. Be a little bit more diverse.
Yeah, just be expensive, right? Anything where you increase diversity like that, it's just going to be harder to do. It would be really interesting to try to do those sorts of studies after hurricane, though, where you take areas where they're trying to reestablish a dune and try doing it with different species and different diversities.
Yeah. Well, I don't see any more questions. So we thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here today and presenting this incredible information. It's a wonderful study that's been going on for many, many years. So
I encourage anybody, if they have questions, to just email me or get a hold of me other ways.
okay.
The census is always in November, because late October, November, because that's when we have the grasses still flowering, so we can tell which species is which. And so we're already planning for this year's census, I always look forward to it. It's a beautiful site. I love St. George Island. State Park is an amazing feature for our state.
Yes, yes. And somebody, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble reading this all. It's in the chat. And it says, since 1899, the National Cooperative Soil Survey, the NCSS, seeks to develop nationwide partnership with federal, regional, state, and local agencies and private entities and institutions with a single goal to investigate, inventory, and document, classify, and interpret, publish about soils. The beginning in the 1990s. Shelf study, not sure where this has come from, but I know we have had, USDA has been doing a study, a soil study with Reuben Wilson. So I think that's an odd chat. That might have been left for a couple of months ago. I'm not sure why that popped up all of a sudden, but anyway, we had USDA doing a soil study. So
yeah, it's always fun to find out about other data sets that are relevant to ours. So if anybody knows of things like that, let me know.
Yeah, but speaking of, we did record this session. It will be on our website, which you'll get a link if you registered for this, and Tom, I'll forward that on to you. So thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Yep.
All right. Thank you everyone for coming.